Fab. Okay. Right, okay. So welcome then to what is session 6 already. So we're into the second half of the module now already. We're edging ever closer to the end of this kind of first part of the Masters. I'm going to start kind of unusually really with the kind of the wrap up rather than kind of the starting point. So just as a reminder really, next week, not that you need reminder, but next week we've got the in-class test. The in-class test is over in the little PC room at the bottom of the Kia Hardy building. Now some of you will have been in that little annex bit before. The PC room is in that little annex. Okay, so for next Monday, rather than coming here, go straight over to the annex building, and we'll try and make a start as promptly as we can to 10 o'clock to make sure you've got enough time to do the activity within that 2-hour block we've got. So you've got an hour and a half to do that activity. Whether it'll take you an hour and a half is entirely up to you, but you have that time. So you might decide, you know what, 45 minutes in, I'm really happy with what I've done and I'm done. That's entirely fine. But we've got 90 minutes within that 2-hour block to get it done. So the room itself, and so it's the Kia Hardy 034 PC lab. There's only 8 computers in there, so it's quite snug. I can't say bring drinks and snacks with you because it says in the door outside don't, but if you happen to have them and no one sees them, that's not a problem. So just in terms of, if you're not quite sure where that room is, it might be worth going to have a quick check before Monday. So if you're in the Kia Hardy building at some point this week, there's a few different ways you can get to it really. So you may be able to get in from the kind of door at the side of the Kia Hardy building, that bit that's got a little bit of an overhang underneath it. However, it doesn't always like accepting people's passes to let you in. So that's one way you can get in. And if that doesn't work, then there's 2 other ways. So you know, if you're going to walk up the steps to get into the Kia Hardy building, on the left hand side there's kind of a slidey door that opens when you get past, so you can get into it that way. Or kind of, I suppose the bog standard way is go into the main foyer bit of the Kia Hardy building, turn left, go straight down the little set of stairs. You come to a brown door, and if you go through that door, and then it's on your left in that little corridor. So I've probably made it far more complicated sounding as to where it is than it actually is in reality, but it's in the kind of bottom of the annex in the Kia Hardy building. Alright, so go straight to there, bring with you what you would normally do, but for the purpose of that session next week, we're all going to be working on one of the university PCs. So it may be worth, if you get a chance this week as well, just checking in to see if you can log on to the system, just to make sure that it goes as kind of stress-free as possible next week. Okay, so that's where we are. So don't come here, straight over to the Kia Hardy building. We've got that 90-minute slot within our 2-hour slot in the room, and then we'll take it from there. Okay, now on the where are we? Excuse me a second. So on the additional learning resources page for today, I've put a Padlet up which we'll see about popping some stuff up on in groups a little bit later. I've also put up 3 example learner profiles. Now we have seen these before, Dennis, Caris and Jenny, but they were elsewhere on the modules. I've put them together today. What we'll do a little bit later on, I'm going to give you some time to kind of share the draft that you've got if you want any feedback on it, but also to kind of have a practice really in terms of if these were the 3 learners that you were going to be introduced to next Monday, what might you think about that you pick out from their profiles? What might you add on to the lesson plan in terms of this already meets Jenny's needs, for example, or I'm doing this activity but Jenny can't engage with that in the same way, so I need to add something else. So we'll have a look at doing that as well. And then I've also put this FAQ document up about next week as well. Okay, so a bit of a reminder about what it is that you need to do and what it is you can prepare in advance. So realistically, next Monday you will have written your session plan. We'll go over those today. You will have started to write your justification for what that you're doing, and you will need citations and references to support the justification. And your session plans are all different, obviously, therefore the justifications you will have written up until next Monday may be different, but you might be justifying things like the choice of lesson topic. You might be justifying things like grouping arrangements. You might be justifying things like whether you teaching assistant support in the classroom, and if so, how's that going to work? You might be justifying active learning, for example. You might be justifying outdoor learning. You might be justifying the use of assistive technology, for example. So things that you've already put into practice. Yep.
So when we're justifying it, I would think about putting references.
Yeah.
Where would the references go?
So the references would go in the justification section rather than on the lesson plan itself. So in the lesson plan, in the kind of activity bit, you might have got learners are going to be working in friendship groups of 4, for example. Later on in the justification, you could explain why you've chosen to do it that way with the evidence to back it up.
Cool.
And then maybe you're going to be introduced to Stephen next week, and Stephen doesn't like working in a group. So how are you going to get around that?
And then the references would be at the bottom.
And then the reference list would go at the bottom of the justification. Yeah. All right, so the lesson plan, we said, doesn't have a word count attached to it at all, but the justification does, and the justification is 1,000 words, not including the reference list at the end. All right, so potentially you will have maybe 650, 700 words of your justification before Monday. You might have written more than that, and then maybe need to think about trimming bits out of it. And we've looked at some examples in the past where people had done it different ways. So we saw some, for example, where people had done their kind of pre-thought about inclusion activities and how they justified them, and then basically gave 100 words over to each of the 3 learners that they'd met on the day. And we said that was one way of doing it, and that was perfectly appropriate. Equally, we saw other people where they'd maybe picked on 3 or 4 things that they said they were going to do in the session plan, and then added the learners onto those places where it was felt appropriate. All right, so genuinely there's no right or wrong structure to follow. Session plan, no word limit in terms of that. Your justification, what you are looking to justify basically is how your session plan and your activities are inclusive. So how are they meeting learners' needs? Okay, so we could be thinking about this classroom, for example. Why have these tables been put into the format they have? How does that support inclusion or not, for example? All right, so general things you'll have had a chance to think about, as we said, by next Monday. On Monday then you will get 3 example learners, and we've looked at these ones before, for example, so it won't be these 3 learners, but it'll be very similar. So what we'll do a little bit later on this morning, I'll ask you, if you've got your lesson plans with you, to think about these 3 learners particularly, and how you might need to fit them in, or do they already fit, or do you need to do something different? So we'll have a go at doing that later on, and think about what your signposting might be in the session plan, and then what you might need to think about in terms of the justification as well. So if we picked up on Dennis, for example, and we did say none of these learners have got an age attached to them, so you could do whatever age range of learners you wanted from nursery up to university settings, it didn't really matter. But the one-page profile gives you some information about what the learner themselves has shared. So thinking about person-centred practice in Wales, this is what Dennis has said. He likes, what he doesn't like, what doesn't work, for example. So he likes physical things, he's got a good sense of, he says he's going to get a job when he's older, so he's got that interest in kind of car mechanics by the looks of it. He likes working in a group. So if you've chosen group work as a way of support and inclusion in your session plan, then you could make the link specifically to Dennis on the session plan. So students are going to be working in groups. Dennis likes group work, and he will be put in a group with his friends to further support his engagement. Okay. He also likes those clear instructions. He likes having movement breaks during a session as well. So you can pick up on bits and pieces that the learner has shared from themselves, and then what we've got underneath then are the more kind of formal aspects about their areas of need. So for Dennis, for example, so Dennis is dyslexic. Dennis also has a slight stutter when he's talking. So you might be doing, you might have decided you were going to do a presentation activity, for example. Okay, now nothing wrong with that. However, might we need to think about Dennis and some accommodations potentially in terms of that? So you were going to do an activity where children were going to kind of present live in the classroom. However, Dennis is aware that he has a stutter and he gets quite stressed about that. So maybe you would give Dennis either a different way of doing his presentation, or maybe you might suggest there's a different route that Dennis could follow instead, for example. Okay, either of those would be perfectly acceptable, and within your justification you would explain why. Alright, so that's one there for Dennis. We'll come back to these a little bit later. So we've got Dennis, and we could see there Dennis was dyslexic and he had that stutter. Caris, we've looked at this one briefly before as well. So Caris has some kind of physical needs. She's a wheelchair user. So some of the examples people have done in the past, for example, had people doing kind of cookery-based activities. So especially around the fact that Pancake Day has been around the time of doing the test. Okay, so if you were doing kind of food-based activities, then there's some kind of key points there that we might need to think about in terms of Caris, in terms of she struggles with eating large pieces of food. So might we need to think about those kind of food safety and kind of health aspects there for her. And then again, we've got a bit of information about her more kind of formal needs. So she has cerebral palsy, sometimes uses a wheelchair when she's outside. She's okay going around the kind of indoor classroom, but as a result that might we need to think about tidiness and making sure people have put their bags underneath the seats, for example, so that she can move about. She struggles to hold a pen, she has difficulty handwriting, so how do we get around that? So do we offer Caris an iPad, for example? Do we give Caris a scribe instead, so somebody who does the kind of writing for her? Do we give her a way that she kind of orally records the work that she wants to do? All of those are equally appropriate in different ways. Which one might you decide to go down and why, for example? Okay. And then another one then, Jenny. We've also looked at Jenny previously as well. So again, that information that Jenny has shared about herself. So she doesn't like people shouting or raising voices or interrupting when she's talking, for example. If she does seem worried about things, then she does like some kind of verbal reassurance that she's okay. Sometimes she just needs a bit of space to help her focus, for example. So might that be something there that you could pick up on? So you're going to give the class a set of instructions. You're going to go round and see some of the others, and you're going to give Jenny 5 minutes to try and process that before you go and check that she's okay, for example. And then thinking about Jenny's needs a little bit more formally. So she is on the autistic spectrum. She does have some of those challenges in terms of verbalization. Doesn't like to be rushed. She does like following things in a precise order. So are there things there that you might need to take on board? Okay, now what I would say, just those 3 learners, one of those learners potentially is enough to think about. However, you're going to be having 3 learners on the day like those 3. There is no expectation that you're going to pick up on everything, because you don't have the time or the space to be able to do it and justify it. So I would say you're going to be looking at kind of key things that you pick out. You know, so we could, for example, if we looked right down the end of Jenny's information, as well as being autistic, Jenny is also asthmatic. So if you were doing kind of a PE-based lesson outside, for example, might you need to make sure somewhere on the lesson plan, as a note to yourself, check that Jenny's got her inhaler. Okay, so picking up on key things, what you pick up on is entirely up to you. You can't pick up on everything because you don't have the space. So on the day, it's up to you realistically to pick up on what you think is important and how you would support that learner. Okay, but I would say you do need to take each of the 3 learners into account. All right, so I'll pause that there for now unless anyone's got any questions, and then what we'll do a little bit later on, we'll have a look at what you've got with you today, if you've got it with you, in terms of your prep so far, and we'll think about, if these were the learners, what might you put into place, for example. So hopefully it gives you a bit of a practice before next week. All right, any particular questions or concerns at that point? No, okay, thank you very much. So we'll come back to those a little bit later. So what are we going to look at this morning? So realistically this morning then, there's a few things we're going to do. We're just going to recap ASD very briefly. We're going to start very, very briefly to think a little bit about visual impairment, hearing impairment, physical impairment. Very briefly, we're also going to touch on ADHD. And we're also going to touch on English as an additional language this morning as well. So English as an additional language isn't an additional learning need in the same way those other needs we've looked at so far are. However, do have big impacts, and potentially some of the challenges related to EAL is learners whose ALN needs don't get picked up. So, for example, that learner who is struggling in class, the focus is straight away on they've got English as a second language, rather than that is the case, but they might also be dyslexic, for example. Okay. So, just as a quick recap, very, very quick recap of ASD. So we talked a bit about labels last time. We talked about neurodiversity and neurodivergence and neurotypical. We talked about ASD was kind of a spectrum umbrella term that now incorporates different areas of need which previously might have been separate, like Asperger's syndrome, for example, now comes underneath that larger umbrella term. We mentioned this kind of Maori word for autism, takiwatanga, meaning that person who lives in their own time and own space, which personally I quite like, and I think that sets it out quite positively, really. That person who may struggle to interact with others because they live in their own time and their own space. And that kind of recognition that they view and experience the world differently to some extent. We talked a little bit about assessment and diagnosis. We talked about the fact that, unlike dyslexia that we'd looked at the week before, which was an educational diagnosis, autism then is a medical diagnosis. But again, like dyslexia, there is no real tests for autism necessarily, and it is based very much on observations and checklists, and thinking about different traits and characteristics. Do they meet the checklist for this area of need? And if they do, then the chances are this is what we are looking at. However, there were a number of key points to consider, and we mentioned last time then that we used to talk about the triad of impairment up until 2013. So those difficulties with kind of social communication, difficulties with social interaction, and then those challenges around imagination, or perceived challenges around imagination, for example. And then we said since 2013 we now think more about the dyad of impairment. So realistically it's still those same areas but kind of packaged together slightly differently. So still thinking about those challenges relating to social communication and interaction. So that could be in terms of verbal speech, it could be in terms of being non-verbal, it could be in terms of understanding body language, it could be challenges with kind of eye contact, for example, might even things like shying away from physical touch as a result of being hypersensitive, for example. And then the other aspect of that, then the imagination still comes into there, but here we might also be thinking about those restricted or repetitive patterns of behaviour or interests. So that child who lines their toys up rather than playing with them in a way that we would expect. That child who has a very structured sense of how the day should work, and if something changes finds it very difficult to process. That child who doesn't seem to engage in class but knows everything about World War II battles and is a kind of expert in terms of that. And then a couple of key things that we said then were really important. Those behaviours, those traits, those characteristics need to be seen as being persistent. So these traits and characteristics can come on for a short period of time as a result of some kind of change in that individual's life. So family breakdown, moving house, starting a new school, for example. So these traits and characteristics need to be persistent, so it can be ruled out that these traits are kind of a short-term response to some stimulus. And by persistent, it's suggested a minimum of 6 months. Okay, and this could be an ongoing 6 months now, but also it could be 6 months prior to the start of assessment as well. So persistent and also in multiple contexts. So this is that young child who doesn't respond to physical contact with parents at home or siblings, but also shies away from children in school, and also doesn't like being part of a group of people in a shopping centre, for example. So persistent and multiple contexts, again, to rule out whether it's a response to a particular area. We talked a little bit then very briefly about some examples of tips, and again these are very basic strategies, so there may be things here that you could pick out in terms of learners. So Jenny earlier on, for example, like we mentioned, has having that diagnosis of ASD. Here are some things that we could pick on in terms of how we might support Jenny in class. So thinking very much about that focus on what they should do rather than what they shouldn't do. So I think we saw a little bit of that clip from the A word, or you might have watched that with Joe and his dad, and his dad taking the music away from him and telling him what he shouldn't be doing rather than what he should, for example. Maybe we need to give learners just that time to process new information, and sometimes that can be quite uncomfortable. So we give people a few seconds to process, and then it starts to feel a little bit awkward unless we jump in and prompt. So it's making sure we kind of give that space, for example. Maybe we've got verbal clues like visual timetables or now and next boards that we've mentioned, for example, which are accessible, which show this is what you're expected to do, or this is what's going to happen during the day. Potentially making sure we are precise about starting and finishing. So this is when you're going to start, this is what you're expected to do, this is how long you've got to do it. So being quite concrete in terms of the support that we give. Okay, so just going to touch on this very briefly today. Now, what I would say is during the test next week, I don't think I've put in anyone who's got a visual or hearing impairment, but the areas of need we've looked at so far definitely come into it. And I would say potentially thinking about Caris that we'll go back and look at later on, there is some element of physical impairment there as well. Okay, now there's no reason why you couldn't think about these things anyway as part of kind of generally friendly, inclusive classrooms, but there isn't going to be a learner who is blind or deaf, for example, that you're going to be expected to fit in to your sessions, or deaf blind. Yeah, so having that kind of multi-sensory impairment, so that's not going to be an issue. But there are things that are, do you know what, dyslexia-friendly everyday classrooms, autism-friendly everyday classrooms, speech, language, communication, everyday friendly. There are things that we can think about that are generally friendly and supportive to these areas of need as well, even if we don't specifically have someone who is blind or deaf, or blind and deaf, for example. Okay, so thinking about those learners in particular, so maybe these learners are a little bit more simplistic to conceptualize because those needs are more visible. And some of the challenges learners with dyslexia or ASD in particular might face is that it's that kind of hidden need. It's not necessarily obvious that the learner has those challenges. And when we're thinking about such learners, we might be thinking about educational needs, but we also might be thinking about their kind of wider habitation needs as well, in terms of transport, in terms of getting around the school, in terms of support with toileting or eating, for example. So there might be a wider range of things that we need to think about here, as well as supporting their learning, for example. So, in terms of hearing impairment, again, I'm not going to kind of dwell on this very much this morning, but realistically, same as autism, there are all sorts of different levels that hearing impairment might be evident at, which can be from mild to severe, which can be from temporary to permanent. So it's not uncommon for young children to kind of go through phases of having that kind of glue year, for example. So that kind of temporary challenges around hearing, which can have all sorts of impacts, especially when we're learning literacy, for example. So thinking about 4, 5, 6-year-old learners in school who may be experiencing some kind of hearing impairment, even if temporary, thinking about how we pick up on and teach letters, the alphabet and the sounds they make. So even those kind of temporary challenges can have a long-term impact. And then we've also mentioned this term previously as well, I think, the difference between kind of lowercase d deaf and uppercase d deaf. So those learners who might identify as being uppercase d deaf tend to be those learners who've been deaf from birth. So they were prelingually deaf, or they were deaf maybe not from birth but before they started to speak. And one of the main differences here potentially is that these learners might have sign language as their first language. So those learners who are lowercase d deaf might have started to speak before losing their hearing, might also lip read, might also be able to verbalise speech as well. So there is some kind of cultural impact in terms of identity, in terms of this. as well. Okay, and there's all sorts of debates, if anyone is interested in terms of that, in terms of, well, I am deaf, why should I be expected to learn to lip read or verbalise? Why shouldn't you be expected to learn sign language to communicate with me, for example? Okay, so I've put a brief video up on here. I'm not going to play it now, but it's quite a nice clip. It's about 10 minutes long. I think the first 5 minutes of the clip is really interesting, and the clip itself is focused on a school in Birmingham. It's a mainstream school, however they do have a specialism in supporting learners with a hearing impairment, and they talk about what they do in terms of supporting inclusion, for example. So again, like we saw in the Ysgol video, they talk about the focus on what the learner can do. They talk about a focus on supporting learners to have high aspirations. And you get to see things like examples of assistive technology that the school is using. So in some cases that's kind of hearing loops, for example, and you can see some of the teachers walking around with the kind of the mics plugged into them. And they also talk about how they support other learners to engage with the pupils with the hearing impairment, and also how they engage with the kind of the wider hearing impaired community in Birmingham in this case as well. So it's quite a nice informative little clip in terms of what they do to support inclusion. Now, thinking about hearing impairment, there's all sorts of challenges that might have on a learner, and probably the first and the most obvious is that impact upon communication. So might have an impact in terms of speech and language, so that ability to hear communication from somebody else, that ability to verbalise or communicate back. Can also have an impact in terms of academic achievement, especially in terms of literacy. And can also lead to social isolation and poor kind of self-identity as well. Okay, very difficult to make friends if you can't communicate and interact with others, and if others can't communicate and interact with you. And potentially might have an impact in terms of vocational choices moving forward as well. So you are deaf, these types of jobs are not for you. Okay, so again you will see some slides here that I've taken from the PGCE realistically. So examples of some tips. So some of these are kind of tips for all. So these are maybe things that we can do that are generally friendly and supportive, and then maybe depending upon the level of need, these are things that we could do more specifically. Okay, so on a very basic level, it could be things like making sure that as the teacher speaking to the class, you are facing the class when you are speaking. Now I can think back to being in school and kind of writing things on the board while speaking at the same time. How many times was I actually facing the board? Who can engage with that? Making sure that there are visuals to support the verbal communication. Making sure that directions or activities are repeated, for example. And then there are things that might be a bit more specific, so we might be thinking about where the learner sits, and potentially it's worth asking the learner where they prefer to sit. Okay, so Jess, I know, doesn't have a hearing impairment, but Jess has decided to sit there today, for example. There might be some interference from the projector. So if I physically ask Jess to sit there without thinking about that, that might have challenges. Again, potentially, do we sit a learner in a place where it's easier to lip read and see facial expressions, for example? Other things to think about could be, again, I suppose there's a common response. If we know someone has a hearing impairment, what do? We speak up, we raise our voice, maybe we shout. Do we need to do that? No. So many of these learners might be wearing devices that are amplifying your voice anyway. So you shouting at somebody who's wearing a hearing aid is not particularly helpful. And then I think these last couple of points are quite helpful as well in terms of not just hearing impairment, but anyone who has kind of an assistant attached to them realistically. as staff, do we communicate with the support assistant rather than directly to the learner? And I think unfortunately quite commonly we do. We talk to the adult that's sitting with the learner and expect that adult to kind of translate for us rather than talking to the child themselves. Okay, so do we talk through the interpreter or the assistant rather than to the learner? So I think that's quite a useful point to take on board in terms of any learner, realistically. So some very basic, simple things there that we could think about. Okay. Visual impairment then. So only about 0.2% of children in the UK are diagnosed as having some kind of visual impairment. Again, is that an accurate figure? I don't know. Anybody read the comedian Chris McCausland's autobiography, for example? Okay, so that's quite interesting. So he talked about the fact that when he was in school, he knew he struggled to see the board, he knew he struggled to read in books, for example, but he wasn't aware that that was out of the ordinary for anyone else. And he talked about the fact that he never really mentioned it when he was in school because he didn't really know what was normal or not in terms of vision. And it's only as he got older that he realised he was losing more and more of his vision, and it started to become a problem. So do we still have some learners potentially where some visual impairment is still hidden to some extent? Okay, again I've put a short video on here. This video is about 4 minutes long if you want to follow this one up, and this one's quite an interesting one where a parent is talking about their daughter Lily Grace, who lost her vision as a result of having a seizure not long after birth. And Mum is talking very passionately about how she wanted Lily Grace to go to a mainstream school and not to be viewed as being different, despite the fact that she is totally blind. And we see Lily Grace kind of walking around the school using her kind of cane, for example. We see a little bit about what she does in the everyday classroom in terms of engaging in sessions, and we also see her being taken out of class to do kind of specific support strategies as well. And one of the things which I think is really interesting that we see with Lily Grace in the video is Mum wants her to be independent, and it shows how they're kind of training her to catch the minibus to school by herself and how she does that. And then when she comes home from school, she can almost sense going into the house who else is there and things like that. So that's quite a nice little video if you're going to want to watch that following up. So again, what kind of challenges might that have? So quite similar, I suppose, to the hearing impaired ones. So challenges in relation to interaction and communication can have an impact in terms of academic attainment, and potentially we see this perhaps with people as we go through the lifespan, is this becomes more debilitating as we get older. And in particular, adults who lose their sight potentially become more vulnerable, more likely to trip and fall, more likely to break bones, for example, and potentially become more socially isolated as a result in compared to a hearing impairment, for example. So again, what might we do to support? So again, borrowed this slide from the PGCE. Very simplistic tips for all and then tips for some. Okay, so making sure that we also explain visual materials that we give out. Okay, giving oral instructions, including tactile opportunities. So when we are teaching the alphabet, for example, we don't just say out the sound and show the letter A. Maybe we also use things like sand trays where learners can feel the shape of the letters with their fingers, or we give them Play-Doh and we get them to make the shape of the letters so they can feel it and touch it, as well as kind of reinforce the other senses in relation to that. And those strategies are also helpful for dyslexic learners as well. and then think about what we might do. So we might need to think about modifying resources in some way. So do we need to give kind of large print? So for those learners who've got a level of visual loss rather than total blindness, for example, do we use page magnifiers? Do we again encourage people to sit in particular places? And then potentially, do we need to make sure that our classroom layouts are consistent and clutter-free, for example, so the learner knows their way around and can get around without being impeded. Okay. So very, very briefly then, I'm just going to mention this as well. So an area of need that you might come across next week to some extent is ADHD. So what might we be thinking of in terms of traits and characteristics in terms of ADHD? So those challenges with concentrating, potentially we might have impulsive behaviours in the classroom. Put these slides the wrong way around. So what might be some of the things that we might be thinking about? So that learner who is distracted, that learner who is forgetful. So you were doing an activity today and children have to bring something with them. How do you ensure that so-and-so is likely to have done that in advance if there's something that they need to remember? Might there be challenges in terms of impulsive behaviour? So you're doing a cookery lesson where they've got to chop some vegetables, for example. What might you need to ensure in terms of safety if you've got knives around, for example? Or potentially you've kind of got those inattentive challenges as well. Okay, you might have got that person who is fidgety, that person who's restless, that person who can't sit still, that person who finds it difficult to wait turns and just snatches things off people. That person who just talks constantly in class when you want them to listen, for example. So a range of different traits and characteristics that you might experience, and then some just examples of some very basic ADHD tips. So the importance of establishing clear routines and expectations. Okay, now we've said autism is likely to come up next week. Is that also potentially a helpful strategy for a learner who is autistic, in terms of thinking about the routines and expectations within the classroom? Thinking about clear and concise instructions. Do we need to give learners extra time to support them to complete tasks? Do we, if we're given lots and lots of instructions, need to break those up into more manageable chunks? Do we need to think about positive reinforcement and praise? That might be something that you've thought about already in terms of all learners in the class, in terms of making sure they engage, but might it be something that we need to think about more specifically, for example? Okay. Do we also need to bring in things like movement breaks? Okay. So what I'm going to ask you to do now is to stop listening to my croaky voice this morning for a bit, and I'm going to ask you to work in groups. So I'm guessing this is going to be in pairs if you're happy to do so. Now realistically, I've put up on here 2, 3, 4, 6 different areas of need. Dyslexia, ADHD, ASD, physical impairment, hearing impairment and visual impairment. Now we've before why we've looked at dyslexia specifically and ASD specifically is because they're going to come up next week. ADHD is likely to come up next week, as is physical impairment to some extent. Okay, just because we're going through different areas of need, I've put hearing and visual impairment up just to kind of make sure we've covered bits of everything. So what I'm going to ask you to do for the next 20 minutes or so is, in your pairs, pick 3 of these each. So maybe Jess and Tia, if you want to pick 3 of those, and then Alex, I've forgotten, Flo, couldn't think of the word, I was going to call you Meg, then I don't know where the hell that came from. So Alex and Flo, not Meg, maybe then you pick the other 3. And then what I'm going to ask you to do is to pop something up on the Padlet which could be helpful in terms of supporting next week as well. So realistically, so for the 3 different areas of need that you're going to do, what do we mean by that area of needs? What are some of the characteristics? what kind of tips and strategies might be helpful. So we've already mentioned some of these quite briefly, but are there other things as well? And what I'd also like you to think about, because this hasn't been covered in particular, is there anything in terms of assistive technology or AI, for example, that could be useful in supporting learners' needs? So there might be certain things that are a bit more obvious. So for example, dyslexia, we might get the learner to put the speech to text software on, or a screen reader on if they're using a laptop, for example. But are there other different types of technology that might be useful? And then also what I'm going to ask you to do is take a look at different types of websites and resources that might be helpful. So what you will see, for example, on Canvas is at the bottom of the additional learning needs page for this week, I've put some examples of different websites already that are quite helpful in terms of getting resources and ideas from. So physical impairment, ADHD, for example. We're going to look at EAL a little bit later on, although it's not a focus for next week. So there are some areas that, do you know what, I've already found these for you, and there's no reason why you can't use these going forward, but there may also be something as well. So the aim is to put a little bit of information together which is helpful for you and everyone else in the group in terms of finding things either for Monday or to kind of support your thinking before Monday. Okay, so I don't know how you want. Are you happy to split those up yourselves in terms of which 3 you're going to do, or would you prefer I told you which ones you're going to do? Say that again, sorry. I could indeed, Flo, not Meg. So let's have a look. So I'll start this side then. So Flo and Alex, if you want to do ADHD, EAL, and let's go visual impairment, and then Jess and Tia, you're going to do hearing impairment, physical impairment, and I forgot to add one on here which I'll put dyslexia on here as well. So if you're happy to do those 3, is that okay? Fab. So it's 10:48 now. We normally stop and have a break at about 11ish. So if we see what we can get done between now and then, again, just kind of basic bullet points really. What might a learner with these needs find challenging? What might be helpful? How can we get assistive technology in to support in some way? So that could be something you bring in next week that you might not have thought of so far. And then are there useful websites that you found that might be good for signposting people to? And then on the Padlet you'll see that there's a space for those. I'll add the dyslexia one on now, Jess and Tia, and then see where we go. Will it let me do this? Okay. So, as I said, thank you very much for anything that you've posted so far, or anything you get to post between now and the end of this morning. Realistically, the aim there is just to kind of work together in some way of trying to find bits of information that might be helpful, so that you're not all individually trying to find and reinvent the wheel next Monday. So as we said, in the test next week, you got full access to Google, what's up on Canvas. There may be things that you look back on to refer as a starting point in terms of trying to find information. Okay, so very briefly this morning then, we've spent a little bit of time thinking about hearing impairment, visual impairment and physical impairment, potentially more visible areas of need, and maybe some that are a little bit more simplistic to contextualise in the classroom and think about support required. But although, as you mentioned, Flo, sometimes it's surprising how many of those needs do get missed as well, because we don't realise, or the learner doesn't realise, that they do have those challenges. So I'm just going to go on and spend a few minutes this morning then, before we go back and look at anything you want me to take a look at in terms of your plans so far, and also thinking about kind of putting Dennis, Caris and Jenny as examples of learners into those. And we're going to focus for a few minutes on English as an additional language. Now, as we said at the start of the session, really, English as an additional language is not classed as an additional learning need. However, it can lead to learning difficulties, and also it can impact upon the recognition, assessment and diagnosis of other learning difficulties and areas of need as well. So being unable to engage in a classroom because you do not speak the language is not seen as being an additional learning need, although it is very much a learning difficulty. Okay, and in terms of English as an additional language, then this is an area which has grown greatly over the last 30 years or so. So if anyone is interested in this and wants to kind of look at this in a bit more detail going forward, a really useful organisation is called the Bell Foundation. And the Bell Foundation very much focus upon supporting learners and training educators to work with those learners who have English as an additional language. They are quite a good source of facts, they're quite a good source of resources, they're quite a good source of information. And one of the things you can see there on the board is that over the last 30 years we've grown from about 7.5% of learners in the UK being categorised as having English as an additional language to over 20% by 2023, which was their most recent published figures. We're probably at about 22-23% of learners now, meaning over 1 in 5. Probably slightly higher primary school compared to secondary school, excuse me, but obviously those primary learners are going to get older and work through the secondary school system as well. And English as an additional language is quite a challenging category in the sense that there is a massive spectrum of need and competence in terms of the English language, which we'll look at shortly. And realistically, learners can be assessed and put into one of 5 different categories. So you could have an EAL, English as an additional language learner, who is at stage A, totally new to English. So somebody who's moved to Swansea for whatever reason from a different part of the world and has no English language competence at all. At the other end of that, then you could have somebody who is born in Swansea, has always lived in Swansea, speaks fluent English, can read and write in English, but also speaks Arabic at home to the Arabic-speaking parents, for example. So a really broad range of competence in terms of that. So who are EAL learners? So realistically, those learners who do speak English as an additional language, whether English is their first language or not. And as we said, we've got a wide range of students here. So those students who are here for a temporary period of time. So it was not uncommon a few years ago, for example, for many students who moved for 18 months or so to do this master's degree from different parts of the world, and they would bring their families with them. So that child starting primary school in Swansea because mum has moved from Nigeria to study her master's degree here, where they might speak Igbo at home, for example. However, they are now also learning English whilst they're here. Thinking about Swansea is one of the cities of sanctuary for asylum seekers and refugees in the UK as well. So potentially some children and young people may end up in Swansea, not through choice necessarily, but through physical need in terms of escaping war or other conditions in home country. And then we've also got those children and young people who might be here because they've been sent home to experience UK education system. So not uncommon from certain parts of the world, for example, like parts of India, where children might be sent to UK sixth form colleges to continue their education before going into university within the UK or elsewhere. And then potentially we got those children, as we said, who were born in the UK, have always lived in the UK, but potentially there is a other language heritage in terms of family members. So maybe a parent or parents moved to the UK. However, the child was born in the UK. They do speak English, but also speak other countries' languages at home. Now, how many EAL learners are there? These figures are quite small on the board, I do apologise. I've taken these from most recent Welsh Government figures. Okay, now we said that there are about 460,000 children in school across Wales, so we've got just over 43,500 EAL learners in Wales, so a little under 10%. So we did say probably 20 to 22% plus across the UK, so slightly less proportionately in Wales compared to England in particular, but it is an area that has grown. So for example, figures from 2018 suggested there were about 35,000 EAL learners in Wales. We've seen kind of a growth of about 8,500 EAL learners over the last 8 years. Again, these figures are quite broad, but what you can see on the slide there is whereabouts in Wales these learners are based. And not surprisingly, looking at the graph, the largest area of EAL learners tend to be in our larger cities. So Swansea, Newport and Cardiff. Also do see some spikes, for example, in Wrexham up in North Wales as well, so kind of the largest city as it is now in that part of the country as well. So depending upon whereabouts in Wales these learners might be based, be all sorts of different challenges or different supporting factors as a result. So for example, if you are, I'm going to pick on my home county Pembrokeshire, if you are one of the 640 EAL living in Pembrokeshire, well, do you know what? You might be spread across one of 68 schools. Potentially you might be more isolated because there are less people living in that area from outside of the UK. Maybe schools have less experience in supporting learners with your language needs. Thinking about different cities in Wales, then potentially you've got that larger support network. We do have in places like Cardiff, for example, one of the oldest Somali populations outside of Somalia, thinking about the impacts of Cardiff when it was a port city in particular. So potentially you've got more experience of that language, potentially you've got more cultural contacts, potentially you've got more of a social network. Potentially schools have had a longer term understanding and experience of supporting your needs. So whereabouts you're based might have an impact, and also potentially what language you speak could have an impact. Now these figures are a little bit elderly. I can't find more up-to-date ones than these, although I'm sure they're there. But these were figures from 2018 talking about the most commonly spoken languages that weren't English or Welsh across Wales. And here we can see we are looking at thousands. Okay, so the most common spoken language that wasn't English or Welsh was Polish. And again, there are quite large and quite long established Polish communities in different parts of Wales. So when I used to live up in Wrexham, for example, there was a part of Wrexham that had 4 different Polish specific supermarkets. There was a Polish language centre, there was a Polish youth club. So communities had been there for a long time. And then when we look at some of these others, Bengali, Arabic, Urdu, Punjabi, for example, Chinese, Somali. So again, probably languages there that we wouldn't find surprising. But then a couple that maybe are a bit more specific. Okay, so Tagalog, for example, which is a dialect from Manila in the Philippines. So why did we have 1,000 children in Wales who speak that dialect in particular? And it was largely to do with the NHS, for example, trying to recruit healthcare assistants and nurses from the Philippines, who then moved to Wales, who brought their children and families with them. So we started to see concentrations of this language in certain parts of Wales, like in Colwyn Bay up in North Wales, for example. And then when we compare that to England, now one of the things, this is from 2018 again, you can see some of the languages are the same, like Polish and Punjabi and Urdu and Bengali, for example. But key difference here, we're looking at hundreds of thousands of speakers rather than thousands. So we had about 560,000 Polish speakers in England, for example. But you can see some of the languages are different as well. So a large French-speaking population in parts of England, Spanish-speaking populations. Okay, so EAL, having English as an additional language, can be challenging in its own right. So you go to a school where you can't speak the language and potentially no one there speaks your language either. So there are those challenges in relation to communication. When I started teaching, I can remember a learner in my class, and she was called Mickey, and she was from Japan. And when I worked up in Wrexham, a number of different Japanese manufacturers, like Toshiba, for example, had manufacturing plants in North Wales. Very often they would send their senior staff from Japan to come and run the factories, employing kind of local Welsh populations. And Mickey turned up at the age of 14 into my GCSE geography class. I knew konnichiwa, she knew hello. Realistically, that was kind of our level of communication in terms of trying to support Mickey through her GCSE exams. Somehow ended up being quite successful. I'm not quite sure how, but very much that was based on her rather than me in terms of what she did to integrate rather than the support I was able to offer her. So thinking about the language itself, thinking about whereabouts in the country the person might be living, there are all sorts of different factors that impact upon that child's experiences within school. So it could be, for example, the reasons why they are in the UK. So are you here because your parent has secured a high-paying job in the country and therefore you are coming perhaps with more advantage compared to that child is here because they are an unaccompanied asylum seeker who happens to have been settled in Swansea and don't know where their parents are and have been separated from them since being in a refugee camp 5 years ago, for example. So the reasons behind being in the UK might be different. Educational background. Okay, so there are all sorts of challenges. The education system in the UK is different to how it works in other parts of the world as well. So thinking about when you were in school, I'm guessing most of you went to a mixed sex school rather than a specific boys or girls school. That is quite challenging and quite different in other parts of the world. Thinking about how classrooms work in different parts of the world and what is seen as being appropriate knowledge and ways of learning. So very much, I think, in the UK, a lot of our learning is to do with thinking about building independence and solving problems, for example. Other parts of the world, that focus might be more on memorisation of facts and rote learning. So how you learn and what you're expected to learn might be different. Okay, so you've learnt in one particular way in your school previously, you've now come to another country where you are not familiar with the language and how you are expected to learn and be taught is different again. There might be challenges in social class and economic status. There might be challenges in relation to cultural backgrounds. Okay, so it is quite common, we used to see news a lot about tiger parents, for example, in particular thinking about Asian communities, where there is that kind of focus on academic achievement. If anyone watches Ramesh Ranganathan, for example, he's quite open talking about how disappointed his parents were that he only became a maths teacher, and why wasn't he a lawyer or a doctor like his cousins who'd done far better than he had. So that kind of aspiration and expectations around education. So maybe there's some kind of positivity there, but is that the case in all kind of cultures and backgrounds? Learners who've got English as an additional language may struggle with English or may not, but equally might have difficulties or not in their first or home language. So does that also have an impact? Does the first language also have an impact? So if you think about French or Italian, for example, pretty much it's the same alphabet system as English. However, how different does Arabic writing look, for example? So that is totally different. Even things like the direction of reading, right to left instead of left to right, for example. Support networks. Okay, if you are the only Arabic speaker in a school where there are very few Arabic speaking families living in the local population, does that impact upon your family's experience in the UK? Do you have those wider social networks that you can call on for support, for example? Okay, if you were going to move abroad, would you move abroad to a country or an area where you knew there were other English-speaking people to help you settle perhaps more quickly? Okay, and then potentially the experience of life in the UK as well. Okay, so people might have moved here for different reasons. People might also have different experiences when they're here. Is everyone welcomed? Does everyone have a happy experience in the UK? And again, I can think about, especially when the kind of Brexit discussions were ongoing before that vote, for example, which was having a huge impact in schools where children are going, well, my mum and dad says you shouldn't be in the country, or I shouldn't speak to you because you shouldn't be here. Or people who'd been friends for years all of a sudden now felt excluded because as a country you don't want me apparently to be here anymore. So there are all sorts of challenges that EAL learners might face. Couple of other things before we kind of move on. So one of the challenges can relate to EAL and dyslexia in particular. So sometimes there is kind of that mindset in class that that learner who is struggling with literacy is struggling because they don't have an English as their first language, and that may very well be the case. However, that might not be the only reason why that learner is struggling. So potentially we do have vastly underrepresented areas of dyslexia, for example, because of all sorts of different reasons. One of the things that dyslexic learners and EAL learners tend to have in common is a spiky profile in terms of their attainment and skills. So in other words, they're good at that bit, so they're good verbally, or they're good at reading but they're not quite so good at writing, or they're not quite so good at spelling, for example. And there will be those kind of peaks and troughs. And in particular, EAL can be a challenge in terms of assessing dyslexia in particular. As we've said before, all the tools basically exist in English and are not necessarily available in other languages. Therefore, we need to make sure that before we can actually assess an EAL learner for dyslexia, that they have sufficient levels of English language to be able to use and comprehend those tests appropriately. Potentially, that development of language competence can take up to 8 years. So that learner who moves to Swansea from Nigeria, for example, who doesn't have English as a first language, who is struggling with their literacy tasks in class, might go through 8 years of education before their level of English competence is good enough to be able to access those tests for dyslexia. So is there a challenge there in terms of support being offered or not, or the wrong support being offered or not, or the wrong reasons being ascribed to challenges the learner might face? Okay, so there are difficulties then in terms of assessment. So those tools that we use are normed, as is called, on native English speakers. So if we are comparing the performance of someone who is not a native English speaker on a test where the control group is a native English speaker, is that a fair comparison? In all likelihood, no. Some of those tests are normed with second language English speakers in mind. However, a lot of these tests come from America, where the most common second language is kind of Spanish. So that Arabic speaker in Swansea might be compared against a Spanish speaker in California. Again, is that a fair comparison? Probably not. Okay, and there might also be challenges in relation to cultural factors. There might be challenges in relation to educational experiences and how learners are taught. And equally, some of the questions and how they're worded can be kind of culturally loaded as well. So one of the tests years ago used to ask somebody, if you found a bag on the street, what would you do? Yeah, so it was part of it. It was kind of a reading and logic type question in terms of thinking about processing. So the expected answer was, I would hand it into the police, or I would look at it and see is there identification inside. Yeah. However, you know, and again, this is quite an old example now. If you went to school in Londonderry, Northern Ireland, for example, your response might be, well, I don't go anywhere near it because it could be a bomb. So some of what we think about in terms of expected answers can be a challenge. So again, another flippant example, there are a number of tools that come from America, for example, which gives you a series of pictures and you have to find the correct word for the part that they're showing. And it'll show you a car, for example, and the word they want you to find is hood. However, we wouldn't use that in the UK, we would talk about bonnet instead, for example. So straight away, that learner who comes from a different cultural or slightly different linguistic background is not going to get a fair outcome in terms of what that test shows. Okay, so I'm going to pause there then, because as I said, EAL isn't going to come up on Monday. So we've got about 13 minutes or so before we need to kind of move out, and then we've got the rest of however long you want to, if you want to go through anything today to follow up. But thank you for posting stuff on the Padlet this morning. Does anyone have their lesson plan with them that you want me to take a look at now? Or you've kind of still working on it and you want me to feedback on it by email over the next few days? If you do, if there's anything you want me to take a look at, if you can send it to me by the end of Thursday, I will get it back to you by the end of Friday. But equally, you don't have to send me anything. I do trust that you've got stuff to come next Monday. But if you want me to take a look at anything, I'm more than happy to do so as well. Okay, so between now and this finishing, I will come round and see people and take a look at anything that you want me to take a look at. If there's nothing that you want me to take a look at, what you may want to do is go back and take a look at the 3 example learners that are up on Canvas and kind of think about, if these were the learners that I was going to have on Monday, based on what I've already thought about, what might I need to take on board? Or looking at it, actually, do you know what, I've already put something in place, so I've already said that I was going to give movement breaks in my lesson, and you've made a point of that on your lesson plan. You could then go back on Monday and signpost, movement breaks were built in, this is really helpful for Dennis who finds he needs those during a lesson. Okay, so I know, Jess, you wanted me to take a look at something, so I'm going to stop recording.